Hello, YouTube. It's AJ Mitnick here with Shlomo Sprung, sports journalist for Forbes. He's previously written for Sheridan Hoops, had probably the best named sports blog when he was coming up in college, Sprung on Sports. How you doing, Shlomo? What's going on with you?
I'm hanging in there. Just dealing without basketball. It's been tough. Been watching a lot of soccer, which I know you're really into.
Yeah, I've been out in Israel for a while, but I haven't really gotten into soccer, but a little bit absorbed with basketball. But yeah, must be very interesting times being a reporter during, this COVID-19 situation. I know you usually are a rat, like going to, I think, Knicks and Nets games and just being all over. What's it been like being just stuck, not being able to have the same access going to games?
I mean, I miss it terribly. I miss all the people and the writers and the arena staff and all just the familiar faces and the sounds and the sights and the smells and the routine of games. Now I barely wear pants. Like it's all sweatpants. Like I just need an excuse to go outside and like put on a pair of jeans. It's rough in terms of you know socially and also fashion wise. Like all these NBA games, people have to you dress up. It's like it's a fashion runway, and I actually really enjoy that aspect of it. But now I just have to subsist on my sweatpants and watching Premier League and um, baseball and thankfully college basketball is coming back soon. I think I'm going to have to dive really deep into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people will agree that even though obviously sports isn't the same as it was before the outbreak, it's definitely much better for all of us at home, like having sports than having no sports, just in terms of, giving us entertainment, and something that we love, like to look forward to, keep us excited. Many people, you as a sports journalist realize just how fired up people get over all these sports debates. So, let's hop right into it. This summer, this off season, well, it's really tough to call it an off season because the season in the NBA ended much earlier for some teams than it did for others. But there were, correct me if I'm wrong, 9 head coach openings that 5 have already been filled, and we got 4 remaining. I think after Tyronn Lue just signed with the Clippers, I think you got 4 teams remaining. You wanna, let's go. You just released an article on Forbes looking at the Knicks situation. The Knicks hired Tom Thibodeau. They have Leon Rose now running the show over there. Well, what do you think about the Thibodeau hiring in New York?
I mean, he brings a lot of familiarity with Leon Rose. We're both at CAA Creative Artists Agency, and so there's that level of comfort and familiarity that they have with one another. And so I think being new to the job like Leon Rose is, I think having familiar faces around him is that comfort level is something that was important to him. But is Thibs the right coach to develop the Knicks players like R.J. Barrett and Mitchell Robinson and Kevin Knox and Frank Ntilikina? Maybe not. So you could see them bringing in more veteran type players that Thibodeau likes, or you could see him try to roll with that. I would have probably gone with a more of a developmental coach for the team, but Tibbs knows how to win. He knows how to instill a good culture, a good defensive culture. But there is, issues of whether Tibbs knows how to really coach the modern NBA with the, minutes limits and different restrictions that teams have. But I did hear from a source that he went around last season to a bunch of NBA teams and kind of took notes on what teams have their modern practices are. He used to be an assistant under Doc Rivers with the Celtics. I heard from his source that he spent at least a decent amount of time with the Clippers back when Rivers was in Los Angeles, kind of taking notes and really kind of resetting himself on what it means to be a coach in the NBA in 2020. Well, he won't get to do it in 2020, but he'll get to do it hopefully in 2021.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure it was Zach Lowe, but it might have been Woj on their Spotify podcast. Brought Dibs on as a guest, where he explicitly was talking about how during the season, while he was out of work, was going from team to team and seeing how teams are running practice differently than in the past, and kind of getting a feel for how teams operate. But in general, Thibodeau has been an NBA lifer, and he's been around the league that's evolved multiple times since he's been, starting his career as an assistant coach. that I think it's reasonable to believe that with all this time off, he definitely has learned the nuances of the modern aspect of the game. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be capable. But I think your original question actually is like uh, quite a conundrum for the Knicks, because on the one hand, part of the reason why the Knicks haven't really been able to sustain long-term success has been because they haven't internally developed draft picks and free agent signings, and organically developed their team to be a long-term successful team. But on the other hand, the Knicks fans and just their organization in general, I mean, they're not the 90s Knicks that you and I grew up on, where they were contenders and everybody loved them and had a passion for them. The Knicks kind of are desperate to have star quality and results that it's honestly it's not an easy situation for Leon Rose to be in, because I think that there's a case to be made for both sides. Um, which direction do you think they're going to go? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, what I think should happen is that they should try to, as I wrote in my Forbes article, build kind of the right way, like the Brooklyn Nets did, use their cap space and they're kind of there's all these non-guaranteed and partially guaranteed contracts that they have to try to use that cap space, build up young assets, take on bad salaries, and there are going to be a lot of them since the salary cap is going to be either stable or lower with all the lower revenues that the leagues had because of the pandemic. And so teams are going to have to offload salary. The Knicks could take that on, take some young players, take some draft picks with all the cap space they have, and try to build a better future. Or they could fall into the trap and they could try to use that cap space and get a well-known star player past his prime, like Chris Paul or Russell Westbrook, like the rumors have been going around over the past several days have been. So they have these two paths in which they could go on. Last summer, they missed out on Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. They kind of took a different route. They signed a lot of power
Every power
forwards,
forward.
every power forward. They have Julius Randle now and Bobby Portis and Taj Gibson, and so but they did do a smart thing. Steve Mills did was sign these players to 1-year deals, and the second year or third year is either a team option or a partially guaranteed. So they could now Leon Rose has the chance to take advantage of that by declining options or re-signing these guys to more team-friendly deals, or using the cap space that they have to build up their chest of assets. They did some smart. They have all these picks from the Porzingis trade. Now they have a first-round pick this year from the Marcus Morris trade with the Clippers, which they were smart to get. And so they have these divergent paths that they could take, is kind of have a slower, more gradual rebuild around these players in the 8th pick in this year's draft, or they could, fall into the trap of going after the big names, which they have been known to do over the last 20 years, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, you have the Houston Rockets, who recently Daryl Morey has stepped down, in light of the Rockets' lack of playoff success during his tenure. And, despite, correct me if I'm wrong, I think during his period with the Rockets, they were second overall in record after the San Antonio Spurs. They had great regular season success, but no title, and, several disappointing playoff performances. That they now are switching leadership, and now Mike D'Antoni, who no longer is continuing with Houston, that they really have had a very specific way in that they've run their team. Radical, very statistic oriented, going small, shooting lots of 3-pointers, playing lots of isolation. That they really have dug deep into Morey style and D'Antoni style, and now they've changed their management and they're looking for a new coach. And, like you said, Russell Westbrook has a humongous contract. And while he's still obviously one of the best players in the league, if you're looking just purely from a salary point, if you're trying to rebuild and retool your roster, like probably his salary needs to either be moved or at least needs to be considered to be moved. Well, how do you see things shaking up in Houston? I saw that they announced that they have 3 finalists for their head coaching job. Well, what do you think is going to happen there, both with their coaching side and with their roster?
Well, right now they have Their cap is pretty tied up. They don't have a lot of picks and assets. A lot of those went to Oklahoma City to get Russell Westbrook. And so they're kind of, stuck between a rock and a hard place. They're trying to hire from within. Eli Stone, their new kind of general manager, kind of their lead basketball decision maker now. And so what they do with coach may not be so relevant because they may not be able to change their team that much. I think they're going to have to, at least for a year, kind of stick with what they have pretty much.
So,
They
so
could try
you,
to
I'm
trade.
sorry to cut you off. So you foresee them continuing down a path with Covington and PJ Tucker being their main big guys and just playing no center style basketball? Or you're saying that you think they're going to stick with the Harden Westbrook core, but they might be able to retool how they play?
I mean, they're with so few kind of big unrestricted free agents out there. A lot of teams are going to have to improve themselves via trade anyway. And as you know, Morey and the Rockets, I think I read that they made the second most trades during his tenure, besides only the Sixers, when they were just tanking and making all these moves all the time. And so Stone has worked under Morey for all these years, and so I think he's always trying to kind of like Morey, kind of maneuver and try to work the fringes and the margins, and try to make those trades to improve the team wherever they have, and maybe they'll sign like a bargain basement kind of center. I think they still have Tyson Chandler either on the roster, or they could re-sign him. They still have things they could do to try to be a more traditionally minded team, but I think just with a lack of wiggle room that the Rockets really have this offseason, I think they're kind of just going to have to run it back.
So you speak about the Westbrook and Chris Paul trade. I think throughout the league and throughout the basketball world, when Chris Paul was traded to the OKC Thunder, people were pretty much expecting the Thunder tanking, and it was I think most people considered it a lopsided trade. Chris Paul has a huge salary. People were questioning whether he would want to be there, and I think both to Chris Paul and to Billy Donovan's credit, things went completely the opposite. They gave the Rockets a run for their money. Chris Paul showed, like, once again, he's one of the best point guards. Maybe it might be a stretch to say of all time, but he's clearly a first ballot Hall of Famer, and he's still up there in terms of best point guards in the league, best leaders in the league, and took players to raise their games. And now Billy Donovan, didn't continue, which was quite surprising. That Billy Donovan didn't continue was surprising to me. We're signed in Chicago, and I'm curious to see how things are going to play out in OKC. Are they going to go for a full rebuild? Now, despite the success that they had with Chris Paul last season, do you think they're going to go through a full rebuild and trade off Chris Paul, Schroeder, Gallinari, Steven Adams? Or do you think that they're going to try and bring in a coach who's going to try to compete now and try to run it back with this roster and see if they can, they got Lou Dort, the Canadian defensive guard that really had a breakout performance in the playoffs. Do you think they're going to run it back, or do you think they're going to totally revamp their roster?
I think the conversations that Sam Presti and Billy Donovan had ended up being, we're going to try to go into a different direction here. They offered Donovan a new contract, and Donovan was like, I don't really want to go through a rebuild. And so he left for Chicago, a team that kind of is rebuilding anyway, but that's a whole other matter. But I think in terms of Oklahoma City, they're going to try to rebuild. Gallinari is an unrestricted free agent, so either he's probably going to leave, and maybe OKC tries to do a sign and trade to get some assets back for him. Paul's contract is huge. I think they're going to try to get out from under that. If they can get out from under Steven Adams' contract, which is very large, too, has a couple of years left, maybe even Dennis Schroeder too, kind of build this team around Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Lou Dort, and all these
Whoever
draft
they'll get
picks.
back.
Well, everything they get back, and all the assets they got from the Clippers and the Paul George trade, which is like 70,000 first-round picks. They're going to try to kind of rebuild and retool around that, especially since the Western Conference is going to be so strong, like top to bottom pretty much next year anyway, with the Warriors coming back and New Orleans, with a full year of Zion Williamson improved, Memphis with second year with John Morant, you would expect them to improve also. So there isn't really much room for teams that are, kind of retooling, or team like OKC that was on the fringes of the playoffs. Everything, they had to have everything pretty much go exactly right for them last year. I don't know if they're, if that's going to be able to happen next season. So I think the full rebuild, I think Presti realizes that they're going to have to retool and kind of blow this all up.
I think I agree with you on that. But, you mentioned the assets they got from the Paul George trade. The Clippers just hired Tyronn Lue to be their head coach, with reports that if Chauncey Billups won't get the Indiana Pacers head coaching job, looks like he'll be his lead assistant. Tyronn Lue was assistant coach for Doc. I believe he also was Doc's assistant in Boston before he moved to Cleveland. That Tyronn Lue, again, for the second time in his career, is getting a head coaching job on a super talented roster after his coach got canned. And I think that there's a lot of questions for the Clippers. I think if you look with hindsight being 2020, I think the Paul George trade so far seems like a bust. I think Gilgeous-Alexander and Gallinari were fantastic in OKC, and I think it's reasonable to believe that the two of them might have helped the Clippers more than just Paul George this past year during this previous playoff run. How do you see things playing out with the Clippers?
Honestly, a lot of things are kind of up in the air. You're talking Montrezl Harrell is an unrestricted free agent. I think he's going to be a little too expensive for the Clippers' taste, especially how the season ended with him having to go out of the bubble and then not being able to be played against Denver because he just wasn't. I don't know. It just the matchup really didn't work out for him. Same with
You're
Lou
politically
Williams.
correct saying because he wasn't good.
I'm trying to be nice here.
Yeah.
I don't know how good I am at it, but so he's going to probably go in unrestricted free agency. Then you have Lou Williams, who couldn't get on the court either during that Nugget series, and so you have all these players that they were supposed to rely on last year as having a superior depth. I mean, I'm saying last season, which was like
Not even last
ago.
season, specifically during the bubble. Because during the season, both Lou Williams and Harrell were fantastic.
Right, specifically during the bubble in the playoff. Those two, just everything that the cohesion that they thought they were going to have and the depth that they thought they were going to have, it just completely blew up in their faces. And so obviously when your plan that you've had the entire year to win this championship kind of blows up in your face, obviously you have doubts. That's why Doc Rivers is no longer there and Tyronn Lue is head coach in his place. And so it's going to be interesting to see what Lawrence Frank and that front office does in terms of retooling this team to get to where they want to get around Kawhi and Paul George, and obviously competing with not only the Lakers, but couldn't beat Denver in a 7-game series either. So competing with them and Golden State and all the teams expected to be towards the top of the West next year.
Yeah, so we got also New Orleans that you're talking about that they're going to be much more competitive next year. Assuming that Zion Williamson will be healthy. At least hopefully more healthy. I mean, he looked fantastic at some points. Okay on a little bit defensive deficiencies on the other some other times, which is pretty normal for a rookie. They got that head coaching job wide open. Who do you think is going to fill in there?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. I've heard Stan Van Gundy's name in there, which would be fascinating. But I think the problem with New Orleans last season was just that they didn't play any defense. And you have to win. You have to play at least decent defense in the NBA to compete, which is not really Alvin Gentry's MO, which is probably a big reason why he's gone. And so maybe a more defensive-minded coach would be beneficial for New Orleans. That they're going to run. They have Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram. You have those two players, you're going to run. You're going to play to your strengths and try to win games that way. But maybe a coach that who would also bring in more of a tough and defensive-minded mentality would be beneficial for the Pelicans going into Zion's first, we hope his first full season there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think they have a really interesting backcourt with Drew Holiday and Lonzo Ball, and that I think in the right scenario, they could actually be an extremely good tandem defensively. I think that they both have, Drew Holiday, I think, is one of the most underrated NBA defenders, and Lonzo Ball has all the tools to be, one of the best team first players in the NBA. that I think under the right coach, he can, elevate himself as a pure point guard and as a defender. So I think it'll be interesting to see who they'll sign. It'll be interesting to see if they'll continue in that direction. For me, it was a little bit confusing that Nate McMillan, going into, just a few months ago, he just signed an extension in Indiana. And then after the playoffs, things weren't really so easy for them this year. They had some injuries with Sabonis, injuries with Oladipo. But I think the Pacers have pretty consistently been a team that's overachieved. When they traded Paul George, people thought that they were, tanking, they were done. Then they totally rebuilt Oladipo's career. Miles Turner really turned into a stud. Sabonis has become one of the most rapidly improving players in the league. Why do you think Indiana decided to move on from McMillan?
I think it was a lot of uh, things on the offensive end where he wasn't really the biggest fan of analytics. His team was, I think, last or second to last in three-point shooting in terms of the number of makes they had per game. And so obviously, if you have where the league is going in terms of three-pointers, you have a coach who is kind of old school and rigid in going against that. I think that Indiana kind of saw that and wanted to make a change in order to improve in the Eastern Conference. And so I think having a more modern and younger analytics-based coach is, I think, a direction where they may be going in, which is why popular assistant Chris Finch is being considered for the job there in Indiana.
He has an extensive background coaching overseas. I'm pretty sure, I forget if it was Sport 5 or which Israeli publication it was that posted a throwback to more than a decade ago when Chris Finch was a candidate to coach Hapoel Jerusalem. Let's talk now about after speaking about Indiana, move to another Eastern Conference team with the Brooklyn Nets, who hired Steve Nash, Hall of Famer, one of the best point guards of all time. I'd say pretty widely considered among the best, offensive-minded players in the history of the game, just in terms of making players better, getting the most out of his team's offensive sets, in terms of creativity. That I think, in that 7 seconds or less offense, I think Mike D'Antoni would probably be the first one to say that Steve Nash's brilliant basketball mind was just as much of a factor into that successful offense as D'Antoni's schemes. Now he's getting his first chance to be a head coach, and really, with a stacked roster with two of the most best talents in the NBA, Durant and Kyrie Irving, with Carousel, with Spencer Dinwiddie. How do you see things playing out with the Nets?
It'll be interesting to see what they do in the offseason, but before that even, it'll be interesting to see how Nash fills out his coaching staff. Jacques Vaughn is going to be the lead assistant, but there have been rumors of everyone from Phil Handy, who is an excellent player development coach with the Lakers when they won their championship, was with the Raptors before that. And even Mike D'Antoni himself has been listed as a possibility for their staff, so it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. And then are the Nets going to try to build up their assets in Karis LeVert and Spencer Dinwiddie and Jared Allen and try to make a trade for a third star? Or are they going to stand pat, try to re-sign Joe Harris and maybe offload a salary like Taurean Prince? It'll be interesting to see if they use their first-round pick, which is 19th overall from Philadelphia. Interesting to see what they do that. So the Nets could go in a couple of directions, either consolidate, not build other assets, consolidate those assets and trade for a legit third star like an Oladipo or maybe a Drew Holiday or maybe someone else that hasn't been rumored yet. Or are they going to try to be like the Lakers, have all these complementary players around the two stars, LeBron and Anthony Davis in Los Angeles and Durant and Irving with the Nets, and try to build the team with a more depth in mind rather than just consolidating for that third star?
And it's definitely going to be interesting to see. I think it goes without saying that I would cost a lot less than Mike D'Antoni to be an assistant for the Nets. So if anyone out there on the Nets management is tuning in here, you can get me for a fraction of the price of Mike D.
Very small.
Yeah. So you got Chicago, signed Billy Donovan. What else? Is there any other coaching vacancies that we haven't spoken about?
You said New Orleans, Chicago,
Knicks,
Indiana.
Nets. New Orleans.
Yeah. Well,
I think we're
Houston
good.
hasn't hired anybody yet,
Yeah,
so
we
that's
spoke about Houston, spoke about OKC.
those are the four.
The one we missed is the Philadelphia 76ers.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what Doc does there. He's got the two superstar players, obviously, in Embiid and Simmons, and making them cohesive tandem is something that Brett Brown really struggled with. So it'll be interesting to see if he can coax the best out of those two players, and then the two guys they got last offseason that are now two of the worst contracts in the NBA, and Al Horford and Tobias Harris. Doc is going to have to work his kind of magic and see if he can get those two to be cohesive in lineups with Embiid and Simmons. They have, on paper, the Sixers are an incredibly talented team. What they lack is the chemistry and the ability to work together in lineups. And so Doc has to kind of shuffle and work with those lineups and optimize it and try to build a winner when the Sixers were, besides the Clippers, the most disappointing team in the league last season.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, us sitting here, we can play Monday morning quarterback all day. But, I mean, hindsight being 2020, I think giving up on Jimmy Butler, or you know what, whether or not the Sixers decided to bring Jimmy Butler back or not, there's been conflicting reports of how those negotiations went down. Failing to return Jimmy Butler, but acquiring Al Horford and Tobias Harris, with hindsight being 2020, is amongst the worst off seasons of all time. And I think it's pretty clear that if the Sixers were to run it back with Butler, there's a good chance they would have won the East this year. I think Doc really, he has a championship pedigree, great relationships with players. I mean, I think there's no doubting the success that Doc Rivers has had throughout his career, even before the Clippers, before Boston, with Orlando. He coached Orlando in a lot of those Tracy McGrady years when Grant Hill was injured. So, basically he had his max player out for 5 years and was able to keep them afloat as a playoff team with creative solutions year after year after year. There's no doubt that Doc Rivers will for sure keep them competitive and as a playoff team. But I think it's yet to be seen if the combination of Embiid and Simmons is something that any of the other contenders in the East have to worry about. Do you agree? Disagree?
I mean, you're going to have to worry about any team with two all-star players on it. But they were thoroughly outmatched against Celtics team, outcoached, outworked, out everything. And so you have to find a way to configure your team to come back with that, with basically the same team. If you have Harris's contract and Horford's contract, unless you get rid of one of those, there isn't that much room to improve. And so you're going to have to come back with a similar team, but just with a different coach. And so that's the kind of burden and the pressure that Doc is going to face in year one with his team.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Listen, Shlomo, I think I really want to appreciate you for coming on and giving me your time and giving anyone who listened all the way through this your insight. Anybody who's still made it through here, go and check out some of Shlomo's works. You can follow him on Twitter.
And if
Shlomo
the Brooklyn Nets are still listening, this guy right here, work for room and board.
Yeah, I mean, you can, if the Nets will bring me over, it'll definitely get me a little closer to have once or twice coffee meetups with Shlomo. So definitely take that into account as a big.
That is definitely the Nets, something the Nets should
big reason to get me back there. So thanks, Shlomo, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, share, and peace out.